Hello, my fellow randoms. My name is Kev Duffy, and welcome to this, our 36th episode of What's Your Random podcast, where I discover and celebrate independent and individual creativity from the inception of an idea to the process and the practicalities of bringing that idea to life. I investigate creativity and creatives from whom that creativity is born. And today is my second repeat guest, and I am really ecstatic to have J.L. Johnson Jr. joining me again. Jeff is the world builder behind Ennead, the Rule of Nine, a comic project that has, I think he's 5 or 6 issues deep, and he's had 3 Kickstarters, and he continues to push the frontier of his own imagination, of his own world, the world that's evolving in his mind, and garnering a lot of support and a lot of fans for his storytelling ability. And over the course of the episode, we investigate some things that Jeff has learned since our first discussion on episode 6 of the podcast in November of last year. And feels like a very long time ago. It's not even been a year, but Jeff has had a lot of success since then. And he's adjusted and changed his strategies moving forward based on his experience and all the experience that he has gained in this short period of time. So it was a blast having him on again. I look forward to him being a frequent and repeat guest again in the future. But until then, enjoy this episode at this time and place and space in the universe. And I hope you enjoy the random. Welcome back, J.L. Johnson. Jeff, it's been just a few months, but feels like maybe 2 or 3 years at this point with all of the crazy events going on in the world and all the activity that you have had on Kickstarter and developing your world via the comic Ennead, the Rule of Nine, and exploring Amashik and other territories and beyond. So welcome back to What's Your Random.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, the other thing that's new in my life is my wife and I had our baby girl. So this is her room that I'm recording in. It doubles as our office. It's been an eventful few months since I saw you last.
Yeah. So that was episode 6 of What's Your Random podcast, and this will be episode 36. So I've had a couple of episodes since then, but I still can't believe it hasn't been more than a year. That was back in November. And since then you've launched not only your first, but your second and a supplementary third Kickstarter, and you have developed yourself in the world of indie comics. So many people come to me and say, oh man, I love following J.L. Johnson and what he's up to, and the evolving world building he's doing through Ennead. So for those of the people listening who don't know you and your project, maybe a quick introduction before we jump in deeper.
Sure. And one of the things that you mentioned there, the supplementary piece, I decided over the last few weeks really to rebrand how I was discussing that. Excuse my puppy here. So I will, and actually she's going to do that. So I know you're recording, but hold on really quick. Sorry about that.
You are good, man. I have a pup myself who does the same thing. They love attention.
Yeah. And they don't want it until you actually can't give it to them. And in that instance, that was perfect timing on Ruth's behalf. But as far as Ennead, the Rule of Nine goes, when I initially came out with the project, it was imagined as a 7-book arc that would have taken about 2 years to put out into the world. And as soon as I got started telling the story, I realized that there was an appetite larger than I anticipated for the story. So these side stories, these bits and pieces of world building that I had left on the cutting room floor came to mind. So I developed initially a companion series that you just alluded to, but then I realized over the course of almost the last year that was confusing, mostly because of the platform that I'm using and the fact that I am so new, trying to develop a series and then a companion to that series at the same time, I realized was a little redundant. So I folded them into one. So what I have now is I have 6 books that are done and ready to be read and enjoyed by the world. And 5 and 6 will be on Kickstarter next month. But with that framing, now I can kind of talk about Ennead the Rule of 9, because now at this point in the story, you really have the scope of where things are going.
So just to clarify and paraphrase for my own understanding and the audience. So you had the Rule of 9, you had 2 issues that came out, right? And then with the launch of the second issue, you started to add kind of a spin-off series that was occurring at the same time as the main storyline, but supplementary to further build the world, because you are, part of your whole thing is world building, and you're building a huge universe in which this story unfolds. But having that complementary series was becoming a little confusing for people. So you're going to try to compress it all back into one timeline, one, sequential issues, so that people don't have to deviate to capture the whole occurrences.
Exactly. Because the timelines are concurrent. So the companion series was really almost like a marketing choice, because the stories were shorter, and at the time, at the time, I didn't think it was the right thing to do to say that these 2 were the same, because I have these really big 30-page issues, which is big for a single issue comic. And I felt like supplementing that or following that up with a short 12-pager wasn't fair, I guess is the right word. So instead of just saying, hey, this is issue 3, I said, this is a story from Amashik. So it's an add-on. And I just realized that was an unnecessary step, because these things are taking place within the timeline when they're released. And the characters who are in these side stories do eventually come back into the main narrative. And with book 6, which is another short, this one's 13 pages, those characters are actually really, really important. As with the 4th book that I came out with, originally the second companion series, that character is arguably the most important character in the world. So I didn't want people to assume that they could avoid this series. Because the nature of Kickstarter, they could, and I noticed that they did. And so originally book 2.5, which is now book 3, has some really important world building in terms of the mythos and the religions and the culture behind our eventual antagonists in arcs 1 and 2. They get a human side, they get a human face in book 3. But if you don't read book 3, then you don't know that. And so I decided that I needed to bring this whole big mosaic and pull it into one solid story. So Ennead the Rule of 9 is the story of really 3 major protagonists. Queen Ilaria Shadun, Anatu Kinnisk, and this character that I just alluded to, Niawi of the Order of the Jade Crest. Each one of these characters is really crucial to the heart of the story that I'm telling. And that story is the story of a civil war. A civil war is being fought over the Republic Kingdom of Athea. A group of 9 families decided it was time to secede from the empire, the Dabashi Empire. Those 9 families penned the Rule of 9, which says that 9 families will form an Ennead and rule for 3 generations over the Republic Kingdom. And upon the death of the 3rd generation monarch, the 9 will abdicate power, and a new 9 will be voted on by the people and ascend to power. From there, that 9 will choose their monarch, and we begin the next 3 generations and so on and so forth. So where we enter the story during the reign of the third generation queen, Ilaria Shadun. And what we find is her husband, King Julius Caesar, is out trying to end the war that Queen Ilaria's grandmother began for their freedom. And that's really that's the moment that you see when you first open up Ennead. And so what I'm doing here is before my pup started whining, what I wanted to say was what I've realized is I'm telling a spaghetti Western style story within a fantasy world. And I got that feedback from a really early reader. And to say it wasn't intentional, is true, although it might seem like I'm trying to say, oh, well, it was easy to do that. No, it wasn't. It just, I realized that the micro and macro lens approach that I wanted to take to telling the story lended itself to that type of description. Because what you have when you follow King Julius, who I didn't mention as a protagonist, I used to, I don't anymore. He's probably the closest thing to an audience stand-in that I would say you have, because he gets to pull you into the bigger picture. And he definitely is one of the viewpoint characters that gives you insight into the geopolitics of the story. But the other three characters, we're really following character-driven arcs with those folks. And Anatu in particular is where the spaghetti Western feel comes from, because basically what you have—
And that's the bounty hunter character that starts off the first issue, right?
Exactly. And he's trying to come into his own in this place he's never been. And he has a set of skills to go for my Liam Neeson line that I like to go for, a very particular set of skills. And he starts off not really wanting to use them here because he doesn't want to make a fuss. And there's a reason he doesn't want to make a fuss, and that comes with time. So I won't really go down that rabbit hole. But if he does make a fuss, he can definitely handle himself.
Yeah. So it's very much like A Man with No Name, kind of this blank character, somewhat blank because you don't know exactly where he came from and what he has been up to this point, arriving in a new town, trying to remake himself, maybe leave things behind that should be left behind and start afresh. And yeah, I think I like the way that you described it as looking at it through a micro and macro lens, because you do have so many different perspectives on a very big world that you're developing and building, from different levels of the social hierarchy, from king level to a guy who just arrived to town. And I wonder, going back to the fact that you're going to merge the complementary series back into the main storyline and continue on with one set of issues, was that the result of looking and analyzing how people were behaving to support you in terms of which tiers they were buying into? Or was it feedback you got from readers themselves? Or was it something that you just felt when you were reading them and revisiting your own work?
Well, luckily, the tier support level, I've been lucky enough to be really successful on Kickstarter. So it wasn't really a financial driven decision. It actually was reader feedback. And so I had folks who have been reading this from the beginning, before there was no art. I have a group of folks who'd been reading the scripts and almost my beta readers. And then they turned into my gamma readers, and they kind of were my ARC readers. And they were all the same people when I started off. But ultimately, some of those folks, I don't want to say they felt slighted, but they felt like the companion stories deserved to be in the main storyline. They felt like, so some of the characters, for example, in book 3, to go back to it, it's probably the easiest one to talk about without any major spoilers. Book 4, which is another short, and then book 6, which is another short, both contain some fairly heavy spoilers for the series thus far. So book 3, it involves a hunting party, and it's my version of almost like a little buddy cop type foray in the woods. And this hunting party they're out and they're trying to catch game for the emperor's name day. And they don't really know the emperor. They're not important enough to know the emperor, but they all wish they were. So they're out in the woods just trying to catch some food so they can make a name for themselves. And they run into a mythological creature. And those characters are already written in to the main storyline. So, and they always were. They're in what was originally book 8, but which is now either book 12 or 13, still working it out down the line. So the folks who knew that, they didn't understand why they didn't get introduced to them earlier. And they felt like there was no need for them to be completely separate or completely avoidable up until book 8/12 when they show up. And so when I got that feedback, I kind of took a step back and then did the last thing that you mentioned. I realized that, the reading order, really couldn't be hurt by putting these things in where I plan to release them all along anyway. And so I went with it because these characters are not, I used to describe that series as a series of one-shots. And although they might be one-shots because so book 3 introduces those characters, they don't show back up until that next book. So technically it's a one-shot, but their story isn't over.
And it's still linear. So,
exactly. Yeah. So, it was a mix of those last two. Again, luckily I've been really successful on Kickstarter for a brand new indie creator. And although obviously funding Kickstarter is just a big part of it, the Kickstarter that had book 3, which was originally book 2.5 in it, did really well. And so it wasn't that, but there were some early readers who, again, gave me some feedback and I went with it.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I know, we talked about in our previous conversation, managing such a big concept, big ideas, a lot of philosophical, societal oriented themes, and how to tie them together into one comic book, one panel at a time, one page at a time. And so I wonder, if say you had issue 4.5 planned, which was at one point going to be a complementary piece, do you weave that into the preceding issue now, or do you still separate it out as its own? So you had separate stories going with this appendix series, and now do you still have standalone issues in the sequential order of the issues, or do you insert pages into the what was going to be the main issue?
So they still, so the two ways I can answer that, and 2 ways I feel like I'm hearing that. So book 2.5 is now book 3. So it does stand alone in that regard. Okay. It is still its own book. It's not, book 2 didn't get longer. So it does stand as book 3. But the other way I'm hearing that is, are there more books like this? And there are, and they're not all short. And this was the other thing. So the companion series, for some, they thought it was just this series of short stories, but book 4 is actually 24 pages. So it's not a full 30, but it's longer than these other shorts. And then there are books that are set to come out next year that are actually, I'm hoping that I have the budget to do this, are actually planned to be longer than 30 pages. And so the issues won't always be 30 pages, but whenever we're in the main storyline thus far, that's how long the books are. And the reason for that is when I first sat down to write this, I wrote about 220-ish, 250-ish pages. And I didn't have an even way to split it. Originally I planned to do your standard 22 pagers, and the story just didn't fall in 22 pages. It fell in 30 pages with, 12 here and 15 here. And so I realized really early on that budgeting for an indie creator in the comic book space is everything. And so, so in that regard, I definitely broke up the book early on into bits that I thought I could pay for myself initially, which was silly. And then beyond that, in bits that I thought I could crowdfund for. So, there's one book I showed you my map, and I won't hold it to you if you don't remember the map and the names on it. But down at the bottom, if you're looking at the bottom left, so what we would know as the southwest corner of the map, there's a big island, and it's called the Floating Forest of Guy. And I have a story about an adventurer who leads an adventure through the Floating Forest of Guy. And this is said to be, one of the few places on Amashik where magic still exists. There's supposed to be large mythological creatures. There's supposed to be, different clans and groups of magic users and all these different things. So it's a really fun kind of adventure story. Think about like, I don't know, like I don't want to say Indiana Jones because that the character in Indiana Jones is so strong. The protagonist is not an Indiana Jones type character, but the way that you are looking for the lost ark type of a deal,
kind of a blank slate sandbox that you could really play with.
And so I get to do a lot there. And another thing that I heard when you asked that last question about the cultures and things like that, and kind of weaving the story together. One of the big themes that I want to hit on, and one of the things that's important to me in this story is that the cultures and the religions feel real, and they feel like a real tangible difference. Not just I'm calling these the red God followers and these the blue God followers. And so part of that it requires exploring characters who really serve as a vehicle to do that. And so in some of these shorter stories initially were pulled out of the main issues because the characters had such big jumps. And so long story short, there's these side stories, these what were companion stories. They do a lot of heavy lifting. The characters themselves are less important than the things explored in the stories. But either way, they still fit in linearly. And so I kind of I mashed it all together, and I would, so, that because you and I spoke extensively. Some of my early readers know that because they've been around, but still very few people, relatively speaking, have read the series. So I imagine in a year from now, it'll be something cool that folks who've been here from the beginning can talk about, but most people won't know.
Yeah. And I wonder, this is kind of going back to that question, but getting into the nitty gritty of process, how are you weaving those together? Because that's what I'm really, impressed with and also wonder about, because you do have such a big story to tell. And I appreciate the purpose of having had these, what were one shots, but then ended up having a life of their own to some degree that reinforced the story as a whole. You broke them off because it acted as a vehicle for you to tell kind of two linear stories at once without having to jump back and forth and have difficulty or challenges with pacing, which I imagine might be an issue when you're trying to tell a story from multiple perspectives. So, whether you're doing that right now or you plan for it in the future, do you have a strategy for, what would have been, let's say, one book was going to be story A and another companion story was going to be story B, and now you're putting them together in one book? Do you go page 1, page 2, story A, page 3, page 4, story B? And then, I know based on our previous discussion, you have all the way through Z. So how do you contend with having such a large story to tell and a limited page count to tell that story, keeping people, I'm specifically thinking about pacing because, you could divert from one storyline or one perspective for a while, but if you deviate too long, people will forget that it exists. And when you come back to it, they won't be able to pick up where they left off. So, as granular as you want to get in answering that question, your strategy for doing that.
So, it's interesting. So there's when you asked that question, I about halfway through, I broke into a smile because the answer to that question, without saying, it actually is the ending of the series, if that makes sense. So that the question that you're asking cuts right to the heart of Ennead and the rule of nine, right? It just cut. So I could answer that and spoil the whole series, and we could go home, right? We're both home. But I mean, that's why I started laughing, because in one sense, in a really big sense, like I could tell you how it all comes together, and so it's exciting that. That's just an exciting question for me, because I think that one, it means you assume that I'm capable of doing it. So thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But then you use the word granular. And so that pulled me away from wanting to tell you everything and how cool I think my story is, to now really going another route. So you talked about forgetting. In your question, you mentioned, if you leave something for too long, someone might forget. So I have what you could refer to as a mother tongue. Not in the sense, not unlike this, like Tolkien had with his, the way that Lord of the Rings kind of came about, and The Hobbit came about, and the Silmarillion came about. They all were based on the fact that, like most people in the greatest generation, that they had a lot of talents. And Tolkien was a linguist, as well as a storyteller, as well as a military veteran, and he had a hell of a life. And but we have the internet, so I was able to use a language software called Vulgar to create a language. And so I created a mother tongue for Amashik. And so that language, and the way I was able to input rules, I was able to input sounds and all types of things. So it's a very unique language. And so in one sense, when you talk about granularly, how do I make sure people don't forget? Well, everybody in Amashik either speaks a version of Nazola, which is the language I created, and they either speak it fluently and purely, they speak it broken up with a little bit of mains or commons, or what we would know as English. They speak it with, more or less accent, right? So in all of these things I can play with. And what it means is some of them have different turns of phrases. So for example, in book 3, one of the phrases that I use a lot is Nya Sadi, right? And it means most high. And it would be if someone in English who wasn't a very devout Catholic said Jesus Christ when they get pissed off. There's another culture in the Northwest, the kingdom of Edhel, that gets introduced in book 3 or book 6. And they have, that's one of the other pockets in the world where magic still exists. And there's a particular character who works for a family of really solar flare wielders. They're almost not fire magic, but sun magic. And so when they get pissed off, they say, for the love of light. And so there are all these little things that, like we do across culture and across different languages, we have different turns of phrase. For example, I'm working with someone now going into my next campaign who's just helping behind the scenes, getting the story out into the world. And she said something the other day, XYZ, eyes of a frog. Like when you get excited, your eyes get big like a frog. I've never heard that before.
I've never heard that
also
either.
From the Northwest, right? She said something to me today, like, oh, your ears must have been burning because I was thinking about you. Little things like that. That's on a granular level. That's how I'm getting folks to realize, like, oh, this is a lived in place.
Yeah.
So that's one way. It's a safe way to answer that question. And then another way, each one of these things, not each one in a literal sense, but each one of the themes that I noticed in my story, when the story weaves back together like quintessential fantasy ultimately this story will do, everybody's following a different thread. So some people are going to come together because of religious affiliation or religious clashing. Some people are going to come together because they're on opposite ends of a geopolitical struggle. Some people are going to come together because they may seem predestined or preordained to. And so all of these things are riding, whether it's a magical theme, a political theme, a theme of war, a theme of love, socio-cultural, similarities or differences. There's Anatu meets a character in book 5, and I'm so excited for that relationship to start to blossom. Actually, I think he meets this individual in book 7. And I'm looking forward to that because the two of them, they pull together so many different things, so many different cultural references from within this world. I'll give you a little inside information without it being a spoiler. The character he meets is the child of someone who emigrated from the empire to Athea at the time of the split. But this person wasn't a nobleman. They were a working class individual. So now what I get to tell is the story of a second generation immigrant and a brand new immigrant to the country. And so they get to connect on that level, which is a very human thing. And so because that's an experience that I think so many readers will be able to relate to, as I layer in all these different cultural influences on top of that very familiar relationship that I'm sure all of us have in some way, shape, or form, we've all bonded over where our families are from before. That's one of the other ways that I'll do that. Everybody is on this tether of some kind, and they all speak to the story's bigger issue. So, culture is definitely something that I want to explore, and cultural difference, and why in some cases cultural difference can unite us, but in other ways it can divide us. And so that exchange right there, I'm working with an editor now, and they kind of just sent me back book 7 as maybe 2-3 days ago. I went through it, and I was thrilled to read their relationship again, because it's just going to add another layer to the story.
Yeah. Awesome. And is that something that you've just started to do recently, to use an outside editor? And I guess we could dig into a bigger overarching question, as my questions often are, is how have you refined, evolved since we spoke, so long ago in November?
It does feel like so long ago. So yes, so in the beginning, I reached out to an editor before I ever started working with an artist. And this editor was probably the reason why I didn't quit. They read... this process. Yes. I almost quit, probably. So I don't know if we discussed the fact that I tried to break into the indie comic space back in 2016, 2015, when I left my job as a teacher. And no artist would touch one of my scripts because they were just not clear, and they didn't read professionally. And so I never gave it up, but I went back into my little hobbit hole and did some work and did some research online and continued to hone the craft. And so when I came back in 2019, 2020, looking for artists again, I had a whole different reception. But fast forward into the middle of 2020, and I'm trying to get this thing off the ground, and I'm running into issues with artists, and that's leading to self-doubt, and I almost quit.
That was on the onset before you and I spoke last time. So when you're trying to kickstart it, essentially, in the non-website sense of the word, we're trying to start the project.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't think that was a revelation in our first conversation, that you were really at a impasse at some point.
A little bit, because I had a big story to tell, and I had spent so much time. So one of the things that I did in between 20, and I'll get back to the how have I evolved. So I think this very much ties into it, right?
Please do. Yeah.
Got to know where you came from to talk about where you're going and where you are currently. But so when I left in 2016, left the indie space to kind of go back to try and work, I had developed 3 stories that they were in varying levels of development. One was about 3 arcs in terms of its planning, and I was doing the really hard outlining and kind of going that route with this story. Another one was actually a short that was completely written, and I just, because of the impact and self-doubt from being denied so many times early on. I never shared that with any artists. And then I had another story, which was really a sci-fi story that I thought was going to be what I told first.
Was that you had a gene editing one
that
in
was
there,
the one.
right?
Yeah,
Okay.
that was the one. And so that was the one that I had done the most actual issue work on. So I was probably 4 or 5 issues into that one. And so I spent a lot of time doing that. But what I was doing while I was doing that, there's a website, it's called World Anvil, and it allows you to do world building stuff. And so I designed a world on World Anvil, and fantasy has always been my comfort. And so I would go there and I would design these cultures, I would design these religions, and I would, get inspiration from maps and all these things. And I was fairly active on my World Anvil page. I didn't share it with anyone, you can keep it private, building this world. And ultimately that was the world that I decided, okay, this is where I'm going to tell my comic story, in this world, because the world had been flushed out so much. Not in the actual linear, this is ready for release type, but I spent a lot of time imagining things in this world. This world had loose constraints. So that's where I kind of started Ennead. And
it allows you, one thing I really appreciated about our previous discussion too, was we talked a lot about capturing ideas in a web, essentially, and that the way that seems our brains work in a similar mysterious way, that you have a big web and you go to the real far ends of it, and there's some random ideas, but those ideas can be brought back to the center at some point. And it sounds like World Anvil and some of the other tools you employ allow you to make sure you don't lose any of those ideas. And
exactly.
When you have so many ideas, that's when you end up world building and having such a big story, like Ennead. But sorry, go on. I just wanted to mention that because I remember and really appreciated that part of our conversation.
There's definitely something that we have in common, because if you looked at my cell phone, if you looked at my laptop, there's random notes from all over the place. There's a random note in the app that I use to write Ennead most of the time. It's called Bear. And it describes a particular adventure story that I could tell that takes place in the open ocean. And it's just the name of and the description of a creature that I would love to explore in bold. And that's all it is. It's nothing. One day I'll get the inspiration to, or I won't, but that's how I remember things. When you talk about that web, it's I'm just going to throw this up here. And if I get to it, I get to it. And if I don't, I don't, but it's there. And one day I might get inspired to do something with it. And so
when you do comb through those ideas, what % for you are all right, that should just that's totally nonsensical. Maybe I'll refine it a little bit or totally delete it. And what % of them are definitely worth just holding on to, even if I don't use them? Because from my own perspective, I look at my notes and I'm like, I can't even make sense of what this is. And that's 50% or so.
When you use the word worth, right, and the phrase worth keeping, all of them, I don't throw any of them out. Now, what percentage do I think will actually get used? I don't know.
What percent? Let me rephrase worth. What percentage of them actually make sense when you revisit them again?
35.
Okay, that's very specific.
There's a lot of notes. I have notes in my phone from 2013. That I have one, and I actually almost gave it away. I don't want to give it away because I know I can use it.
You're gonna use it, yeah.
Description of a character, and this character has 3 particular things that they always keep in their pocket. That's it. It's
I like it.
But there's a genre that I think it works well with, and there's a story arc that I have in my mind, but I can't make it make sense yet. I can't make it worth my time to write yet, but it's there. I thought of it when I was in grad school. I think I graduated in 2014 from grad school, and it's still in my phone. So when you ask me, make sense, I don't know. It doesn't really make sense. But look at it yourself. You're like, what is this? Did you forget something? You need to bring these. You would think I was reminding myself to bring those things with me. It's one of those types of things. So some of it is completely random, and some of it makes no sense. Some of it is completely stripped of context. but I try not to delete it. Because a lot of the things that are now in Ennead are like that. They were on the web, this web we're discussing, and
the web of your mind, not the
not the
internet web.
And I'm not just totally wholesale ripping off stories. They were on the web. They were on this web of my mind, right? And they made sense at some point. I said something else or wrote something else, and then I brought them in. And so, or I went back to another portion of my notes that was a lot clearer. And I was like, oh, well, that will fit with this.
Right. Read the note before it. Maybe it'll give you the context for the following note kind of thing.
But this actually ties perfectly into how I've evolved. So I spoke to an editor up front who was very kind and had very good things to say about I think I sent them maybe my first 20 pages of the series. And they were like, look, just go with it, put the book out in the world. We'll work together in a few months. And then life happened for them and we weren't able to work together. And that was I met them probably in July-ish. And then we were supposed to start working together in September,
of
October.
2021, July-ish? Or
2020. This is right when everything was getting off the ground. And so, I kind of said, all right, well, if I can't work with this person, I'm just going to forge it alone. And then fast forward to about February of 2021. And I realized like, man, I have a small audience, but they're enjoying what I'm doing. And they're very receptive. And some of them are paying very close attention. And they're asking very particular questions very early on. I better make sure that I'm actually making progress towards paying off some of these promises. And that was when I decided, okay, I need some help. And so I decided to do what, again, most of us do nowadays, go online and try to find someone to work with. And so I hopped on Twitter and I started getting more active in the indie comics community on Twitter. And I found who I feel is the perfect editor for me. And they have been working with me now for maybe about a month and a half. I don't know what time it is. Like I said, I have a 5-month-old, so I don't know. But they've been working with me, for a little while now, and they've gone through the entire series. And we didn't change anything that was already committed to art, but we did notice where we could, clean some of that stuff up. So I, going forward, would know, how to handle the story, but. Everything from book, let's get this right. Everything from book 5 on has been molded so far and sculpted so far by this editor. And I look forward to folks seeing how subtly the story is going to change. We didn't make any wholesale changes to the story direction, but some of the things I talked about before, some of the granular stuff, some of the ways in which characters act, the ways in which they speak, they've been just cleaned up. So the characters that I was developing are it's almost like they're walking around in the world a little bit more confidently about who they are. So a lot of the things that I was maybe doing a little bit too much telling and not showing, right? We cut some of that out and just let the characters stand on their own. And that was one of the reasons why I went back and when I read Anatu and Basilia is the character's name. It doesn't matter if you know that or not at this point. It's one of the ways in which I really noticed the difference. When you took out some of the things that I was just lumping in there, almost getting to the point of where I was doing some info dumping, it read so much more confidently. And so again, I'm excited to see that. Another way that I've kind of evolved since then is I started off by lettering what once were companion series books. And now starting with the next book, I'll be lettering the main series as well. So that's another way that I'm trying to get closer and more hands-on with this project. There's something about being the writer of a comic where you create this thing and you write this thing and then you hand it over to someone else and you really can't put your hands on it again until it's a finished project and a product rather. And the artists I'm working with, I have the utmost respect for them, and I'm grateful that they're on the team. But I almost want my hands in the pot again before it's over. And so rather than, again, so much of this story hinges on the ways in which people speak, in terms of doing a lot of the world building for me without having to do any narration or any long-winded speeches or anything like that. So in the first couple of books, I was just sending email after email, like, oh, hey, can you change this? Hey, can you change that? And so taking over the lettering duties is going to allow me to really refine that and continue to clean that up as well.
Nice. And what is that process like for you?
The refining lettering. And the lettering and that bit?
Yeah, the lettering specifically. So, I mean, I've spoken to so many comic creators and artists, but nobody's spoken to me specifically about their experience and process for lettering. So, start to finish in very simple terms, what's that look like for you?
Well, when you get you get the page, the artwork is done, and in my case, there are no colors, but the coloring would be done. You basically get a finished comic book page, and then you bring it to life with the letters. And so, what I do.
And so there's no bubbles at that point, right? You're lettering, you're putting the bubbles, and
I'm putting those in. And so when you look at a comic page, obviously the art tells the story, and so you have to balance. Fitting in what you need to fit in, right? Because at the end of the day, these bubbles and these words do need to end up on the page, but you want to do it in a way that accentuates the art. And I shared my screen the last time. Be mindful this time. So let me just pull it up first. And
let me know if I might need to give you permission. Let me know if
there's a page on here that I actually think, and it's a page that I lettered, and so I won't do this over someone else's work, but I'll talk you through the process as you look at it. And this will be from the latest book, book 6, High Value Target, which is illustrated by Edward Liley. Let me see if I can give you one that's not too spoilery, because it's one of the things that I think when you just look at a comic page, and you see it when it's complete, and you don't really you can't have an appreciation for, and it's super important to the process. If you can't get it, it's fine. I can also just talk us through it, but I'll have it up for my own reference.
Yeah, and I'm excited. Like, I've done some graphic design work before, and kerning and letter placement, and it's challenging. So I add on to the question will be, if you edit the actual script at all, meaning do you shorten or change some of the contents of the bubbles to fit in a bubble when you don't want to make a bubble too big and you have to cut things down? Has that ever happened for you?
So it has happened for me, and I'm sure it's happened for other folks who do the lettering in their own work. But if I wasn't the author and the individual behind the story, I wouldn't really have that liberty. So in some sense, I'd imagine that my lettering experience is easier than someone who's doing it for a story that's not their own. So this page, for example, there's a lot of art here, and the art bleeds off the panels, and it's really dynamic. Edward Lively did a great job, because this book is almost all action. And I love it. And so you don't know this right now, but when this was written, there was actually dialogue in panel 1. There was dialogue in panel 2. There was no dialogue in panel 3. This was here. This was not here. And this was not here. So really, what I did is because of the way that the page came back to me, I had to change the script. I didn't have to. I could have forced it. But, imagine a bubble sitting right here, or a bubble.
Yeah, so people who are just listening, the top panel of this page is a horizontal panel of somebody striking somebody in the abdomen with a staff, and it takes up the whole top, let's say 1/4, almost 1/3 of the page, and it's a very dynamic action. And what Jeff is saying, he removed the text from that specific panel because it wouldn't do it justice to have text covering any part of that action. Am I paraphrasing that correctly?
Absolutely. Okay. Now, I could have gone forward with that decision, but I recognized that the art was doing a lot of speaking, and I didn't think that I needed to talk over that. So what I did was I didn't just take the conversation as it existed and put it elsewhere. I changed the conversation. So if I'll try to do a better job so you don't have to paraphrase as much. But if you look at the bottom third of the page, which is almost equal in size to the upper third, but this is split into two panels, whereas the upper third is one. You have a little line, "We mean you know," and then the character is struck once again in the abdomen, this time by pretty much getting tackled with the staff in hand. And so they get cut off. And then the next line, "I don't know what you've been told, but nothing good can come from this." So that was actually that last bit was actually the first line of the page.
Wow.
And so when you now have the character saying this once they're on the ground, it not only does it fit better on the page, but it's
emotionally.
Now he's begging. He wasn't begging before, but ultimately it still works because of where the fight goes. I mean, he is going to lose this fight. It's not a big spoiler. He's obviously getting beat up here for those of you who can see it. He's not faring too well. But you can also see here in the middle, he says, "Let my men and I continue on. We're headed east to Gritbia." And Gritbia is a place in my world. And we may never go there ourselves. We may never follow a character there, but, it's got a story and all of that. So that's one of the ways, by the way, that I do a little bit of the world building. This book comes with a map. It's a new map. And so you'll be able to see, right now he's on the island of Araxig, and he's traveling south, as we would know it, southeast to Gritbia. Okay, so he's doing, so that's how a lot of the world building gets done in small little bursts just like that. But even that line actually didn't exist. So I added that because now what we originally had were two equals taunting one another. DeFoley, who is the young lady here, she was doing most of her talking by just giving this guy the business. He was trying to meet her by taunting her and talking down to her, and because this character is important, and I won't spoil who or how or why. And so when I got this page back, the entire dynamic shifted from the conversation. So this is one of the reasons why I wanted to, on a process level, learn how to letter, because this happens to me a lot, where I imagine a scene a certain way. And because I don't try to micromanage the illustrators that I work with, sometimes what they give me is way more dynamic than what I thought up.
Right. And so the way you envisioned the dialogue and the text bubbles is, don't want to say thrown out the window, but essentially thrown out the window, because the images are telling the story on the page are not conducive to the original plan you had for the dialogue. So as a result, the dialogue has to shift. You still get the same essence. You still achieve the same goal with the dialogue, but the format, the pacing, the placement, and maybe some of the impact of it has to be adjusted again to match the image. And this is a great illustration of that. And your explanation is really good. I mean, just to imagine a text bubble at the top, you could imagine that would take away from the impact of the action, this attack that's taking place in that top panel.
So when you ask me about process, this page actually has so much. There's another page I would love to show you, but it would ruin the entire issue. So I'm not going. This is like right in the middle. So you don't really know how things are breaking. You know that this gentleman isn't faring too well at this moment, but you don't know who else is there. You don't know where they're coming from. You don't know anything about these characters just by looking at this page. So the other thing that is really key to my process. And I'm learning this as I go, and I think I got it now. Character development is really important in story, but pictures are worth 1,000 words, right? So one of the things that I'll say almost tongue in cheek, if pictures are worth 1,000 words, then any of the rule of 9 is already longer than your favorite fantasy novel. But I know it's not.
Yeah.
Right. But that being said, I didn't realize how much character development can come from the images. And I know that might seem silly to say, but
no, I mean, for people who are just listening, I'll tell them that there's action. This guy comes in the page with confidence. He quickly gets beat down. And by the last panel on the page, he's cowering over in defeat and pleading that he means no harm. And the expression on his face over the course of the pages, from pain to shock to defeat, they all very much illustrate what Jeff is getting to, that, that's the artist at work bringing the story that you're telling them through the script to life. So this is the perfect marriage, right?
Exactly. And so if I and to go to the scripting piece and how I describe this action, Edward nailed it. I mean, I described so I mentioned that there's magic in this world, and there's a magic user here, and this isn't too much of a spoiler. I've talked about other places. The gentleman here is a magic user. He's one of the folks who can use that sun magic. But one of the things that I try to do is I magic should have rules. And for those folks who don't understand, who don't know who Brandon Sanderson is, he's a modern fantasy author, and he has these rules that he uses. And I'm not going to go into them because he wrote essays about these rules, and they're really in depth. But basically, you need to have magic needs to have consequences. Anything needs to have consequences, and you need to really check yourself when you introduce magic into a world. So he's a sun user, but in effect, in his family, they're like solar panels, right? If the sun's not out, they don't really have much charge. They don't have much juice. And so part of what happens in the story is this takes place, early in the day, just after dawn. And you'll notice that he's cloaked and he's in a hood. And so he's not in a situation where he's absorbing the sun. In part, he's in that hood because it's on the run. And I won't say any more there, but so that's why he comes into this with so much confidence. He's not half the fighter that Defoley is. Defoley, if you can't tell by looking at her weapon, for those of you who aren't familiar with any of the Rule of 9, Anatu Kinnis, he carries a weapon that looks just like that. They're from the same
sickle
place.
On the top.
Mm-hmm. They're from the same place. And so Anatu, if you've read any of the story, and I mentioned up front, he's got a very particular skill set. So these folks are very, very proficient fighters. And we explore why a little bit in this issue, and we explore why through Anatu's story as well. So if he didn't have the ability to use his magic, and you see that he, in the center of the page, he's got his hand up, kind of Dragon Ball Z style, getting ready to summon his magic.
So is that a reference you gave for that panel?
It actually wasn't, but when I talked to the artist and I we're building a pretty good relationship. We're of the same age. We're from the same state. We actually grew up like 30 minutes apart.
Oh, shoot.
And so we both were rushing home in middle school to watch Dragon Ball Z on Cartoon Network. And I'd imagine that that's where he got it from, but I didn't say that. But that's what it screams to me, right? The Kamehameha, like that's what he's doing. And I think it's really cool. But that's why she attacks him right there. She knows what he's doing. But ultimately, if he didn't have that, and in this case, he doesn't have too much of it, he's the little boy who's cowering in the corner in the last panel. And so when I describe the action, I'm describing all of that. I'm describing the fact that he's just trying to get enough space between them to get away. He doesn't really have enough power to overtake her. Obviously, if he gets her with a good shot, she'll get burnt pretty badly. But he's not his family, they're not these overpowered. They aren't as strong as Goku and Dragon Ball Z, right? The magic in my world is fairly subdued. And we can talk about magic branches and all that later, or maybe not, because that would be a very, very deep rabbit hole. But there's a reason why magic is relegated to certain places on the planet here. And that's just because it's not that powerful. It's relevant, and it's relevant in this gentleman's geopolitical life and strife, but it's not, you can't take over the world with it. Otherwise,
that's one of the things I talk about with people pretty often, is creating the confines and the boundaries. Because if you have absolute power, I mean, there might be Superman fans out there, but I don't really enjoy Superman because of that. Like, there's not much that could take him down. He's going to steal the show at the end of the day because he's Superman. And the only thing that could take him down is, what is it?
Kryptonite?
Whatever that green rock is. But
I'll come out of the screen. I said it's kryptonite. I'll come out
kryptonite.
Of the screen.
There you go. Yeah. But if, as you create these confines, there's more room for conflict and action and
so when you talk about
and contention.
When you talk about process, that the creation of the when I was putting my magic systems in a box, that was when book 6 was born. I was just on paper, in a very boring fashion for most, but exciting for me, just plotting out my magic system. And this story was born out of that. And it basically allowed me to shape an interfamily kind of struggle in this magical kingdom of Edhel. That bled out of the kingdom of Edhel and into the rest of the world. And
that was a newly conceived conflict idea, tribe, if you will, within your world building that was born like already. You were three issues or so deep, and you had like, I'm going to do this.
Yep, because that was, and again, it came from this idea. So I always knew I was going to develop the map further. And so I knew, so there was an event in my world's history called the Separation, and I could share this as well. When that had magical influence and it had a magical purpose to it. And when that happened, think Tower of Babel, right? But instead of language changing, and it didn't know the sense, magic, and everybody's ability to access it changed. And so you have these places and these kind of spots where magic is still accessible, but it's tamped down because of the events of the Separation. And so I spent a lot of time developing the constraints for each of the 4 magic tiers. And when I was getting to Niawi's grand entrance into the story, definitely the most powerful of the magic users left in the planet, as far as we know. I knew I needed to be able to define what she did, and I didn't want to put it on paper in the story, so I wrote it out. And as I was doing this, it made me think, well, if X, then Y. And literally, as I was creating these different magic systems with their rules, I was imagining, well, how would these people interact if character A meets character B and they each have a different branch of this magic tree? Why doesn't character A just decide to kill character B? They can, so why don't they? What's going on? And what are the limitations that prevent them from doing so? Whether within their magic or in their conscience or what? So from a process perspective, and I'll say this before I start spoiling things, because I get really excited about this part of the story. What you get in any of the Rule of 9 came out of me world building the geopolitics of Amashik. The political systems, the class systems, that's where the Rule of 9 came from. Really, the Rule of 9 is the political idea at the center of it all. But the opposites of the Rule of 9 were what created the strife in the main storyline. The opposites and the juxtaposition of the magic system is what creates the conflict in this part of the story. And so there's all these different things, and there's other things I'll reveal eventually that come from a similar process. As I was really hammering and nailing down what the rules were and what the facts were in Amashik, all these different conflicts popped up. And so that's why we have, all these different storylines that will eventually converge again.
So is there a point where with some sort of text appendix, you will outline these rules for your audience if you haven't done so already? Because, I know based on our discussion, a decent amount about your concept for the larger story and the larger world. And when I was reading the first two issues, I was like trying to imagine it from the perspective of somebody reading it who didn't have that exposure. And so it's impossible to do at that point. Right. But I am wondering, how you put it to a test. Do you reach out to new people who haven't engaged with Ennead before releasing a new issue to see how they read through all the issues as a fresh set of eyes?
No, I don't do that, actually. Something I can definitely consider, but I haven't done that yet. But to answer the first part of that, it's where I sit right now with this story. This is one of the reasons why I realized I needed help, right? Because there's so much that's going on, and there's so many parts of this process that I have in various places written down, but they're hard. When you are doing grocery shopping and you have like all the bags except one, but you can't figure out how to pick it up. Your hands are, I need that bag, but I can't get it. But there's no one here to help. So how do I pick this bag up? And so that's kind of what this.
You just hope your pinky is strong enough, man.
Exactly.
Usually it's not.
You go for it. You're like, this bag.
And lo and behold, that's the bag with the eggs.
And my pinky better not break either. Sorry about the city noise here. So yeah, man, I think there's a large part of this process that I could benefit from doing that. And I do have readers who've been around long enough, and I probably will message them very shortly after this to ask that. But the first part about kind of the lore book and the lore building, and we could go on forever. And I think this would be a good place to pause until said book comes out. But I am building that book. So Apple Nunez, who did the art for one of my stories, book 4, Heart That Wanders, is also one of these artists that I'm working with. And I'm building a good relationship with all my artists, but some are closer in proximity, geographically and in age and in experience. And so that it's just, we click a little bit more or less. But I wanted Apple to be a part of this series in a big way because I really love their art style. And so what I did probably about 2-3 weeks ago is I sat down and we discussed the idea of creating a world book and creating it in almost like a serialized manner. And so the plans are there. The groundwork is laid. Obviously, the information is there. So praying my computer doesn't ever crash.
Get it backed up on the cloud somewhere or another.
Don't worry about
it. That's really exciting. I think that'll be a great tool to, for average casual reader. They could read the comic and follow along fine. Mm-hmm. And they don't need to know all the details, but the details, the world that you've built helps guide you as you're, putting text on the page so that you don't act outside the confines of the rules and the systems you've established. And that's why it's important when you're building such a big rule to set those and establish those rules. And a casual reader doesn't necessarily need to know them, but I know that you have people who are not just casual readers in your fan base and in the base of people who are reading and picking up your comic and excited for each subsequent issue. And I think that they, along with myself, would be interested to understand what are the boundaries that Jeff has set for himself? What are the rules that are guiding his storytelling and the story that he's building? And that's really the fun part of world building, is that there's checks and balances, and, there has to be continuity. And that's when it's most impressive, is when you're able to strike that continuity over such a large story in such a big world.
And this is where I walk on eggshells, because again, what you say there could lead me, if I'm not careful, into ruining some of the ways that I do that. Because obviously, on a process level, it has to come together, and I have to take my time. And my cat is joining me now. This is Sansa for all my Game of Thrones fans. So I have to be careful when I do come out with that book, because, for example, I love talking about the rule of nine, and I love talking about how it came to be. These families, these noble families, they decided to come together and basically throw off the chains or the yoke of the empire. And they did it in secrecy. They came together to do that. So that will be kind of the opening pages of this world book, because the world book will be set in universe, and it'll be told by individuals in universe. And my perspective for this story is from the Republic Kingdom of Athea. And so the world book will be as well. So it will have a political slant to it for sure. But that will be how I come out. And that will be how this begins. And that's very safe to tell. But when I start talking about the constraints of the magic system, for example, and explaining the history of the magic, if I do that too soon in the story, then I kind of take away some of my surprises. And they're not necessarily cheap surprises. They're not like, not cheap thrills. There's some things that I think.
No, but I mean, part of storytelling is revealing new information. If you reveal all of the information up front, and then you have nothing to share moving forward. So that makes sense.
And so it's tough, because there's so much of it that I want to share, because it is how this began. And that's the fun part for me too. But because this story is being told so slowly, and in this regard, it's a good thing that it takes so long for the art to get made, right? Because, the world book will also come about slowly. And I just have to figure out the right time to start, because once you start, and if the perspective is the Republic Kingdom of Athea, you tell that over X amount of pages. You talk about the nine, you talk about the cities that they were from, you talk about, maybe one or two really cool things that happened over the last 50 years as Athea has tried to come to be, but then you got to go somewhere else. And so then when you start telling the story with a slanted political and geographical view on the rest of the world, well, now I'm going to be influencing some people's opinions. And one of the things that I want to make sure that I do is I want everybody, protagonist, antagonist, or, neutral character in the middle, I want everybody to feel like they're valid. You might disagree with them, but I want them to feel like they have a valid opinion in the world. So I don't want to share too much of kind of my view on, which is this bird's eye view of what they actually think, because some of these people are wrong. Some of them are flawed. Some of them might be what we define as evil. And so it's coming. I would like to, let's put it this way. If my plans come to fruition and this thing makes it to book 30 and 40 and 50, it'll be out there in the world by then.
So that kind of answers another question I had, which is, you did, I think, say from the get-go that you were planning on like 7 books, and obviously with the complementary stories and stuff like that, that was going to expand. But like, what is your trajectory from here on out, and where are you in that process of, how many stories do you have complete, and how many do you have outlined into the future?
So complete right now, I'm looking at picking up again at book 12. And again, I'm either going to pick up book 11, and then a book that's already written is going to slide in as 12, or I'm going to flip it. That book will be 11 and I'll start at 12. So that's where I'm at right now. What I have slated and projected is in the 35 to 50 range for this story. The world ends for some, but it doesn't end for all. So it doesn't need to stop there. But there will be a nice bow on a lot of these character arcs by that time. And at
And
that
if,
point in time, we'll see. We'll see how viable it is, and we'll see what's going on. And I would love to get there, first of all. If I could get there, that would be a dream come true, because that
yeah,
would serve as, 4 or 5 nice and thick graphic novels that you could put on your shelf. And that's always what I've envisioned. And I think this is a good place to kind of close, because one of the things that I really, really wanted to do with Ennead was make the graphic novel version of A Song of Ice and Fire, or the Wheel of Time series, or the Stormlight Archive, or any of these really grand fantasy series. I wanted to do that in comics, because every time I read one of those novel series, I imagine it and I say to myself, man, I wish this was a comic book. I always feel that way. I always felt like there was this great marriage between fantasy comics and fantasy and comics. And I know there are things like Conan, and that's kind of making a comeback, and The Green Knight, which is making its movie debut, and there's all these. There's Birthright. So I'm not doing anything new, but from that perspective. But what I think I am doing that's new is I'm setting out to tell a fantasy story that was made for the comic book medium with the fantasy novel in mind. And so when you talked about process and how I manage page count, I'm just patient. And that's why I say we're looking at 35 to 50, because when I initially did the synopsis for the series, what ended up being was 4 different arcs, and each of those arcs has 7 books in them. Well, arc 1 still has 7 books in them, but I added 6 books to the total, or 5 books to the total. So I had to break what was just 1 arc into 2 arcs already. So I already had the first 2 arcs written. So if that happens every time I get to a new arc, well, now I'm might end up at 80. I don't know.
yeah.
I don't 50, not 80, 56 technically, because I think I had 28. So if I double that, right? But if I end up at 56, man, why would I stop at 56? Go for 100. And then there's enough of the world. And as long as I don't rush the process, I think people will, whenever they jump on board, they'll be able to sense the fact that I'm doing 2 things at once. I'm trying to tell a story that fits the comic book medium and is fun, is exciting. And that's where the spaghetti Western bit comes. But I'm also trying to tell a story that's as grand and as beautiful as a full-scale fantasy novel. And so that's why I really love describing it that way now, because I think that's how I'm going to pull it off. I'm going to be patient and tell this spaghetti Western style, man with no name story. We're going to follow Anatu. He's going to do his thing. And there are other folks who could fit that bill as well. Niawi definitely is this kind of Lone Ranger type character. And so that's how I'm going to try and thread the needle. And if the story continues to grow as I tell it, so be it. But the way that this geopolitical conflict and the way basically what's happening is a geopolitical conflict is coming to a head at the same time that magic is re-entering the world, which is fairly standard for fantasy. But again, I have some key characters, key character arcs, and key moments that I think are going to differentiate Ennead from what you come to see, and a lot of fantasy that's out there today, and some of the rules and constraints that I set up so early because I built this world out are going to force me to carve a path again that's going to be different from most other things out there.
Yeah, and I think that is the important part, right? Creating that framework. I mean, the world building, it's a huge exercise that goes on and endlessly, but you create those confines. And then, like you said, if you have the mind and you have a strategy of not rushing, I think you will be able to thread that needle, and you're doing well so far.
Thank you.
Yeah. Should I let you go? Should we wrap up here?
Yeah, this would be a good spot. The little one's ready to go down for the night. So that's it's probably going to get a little noisy here. But she doesn't. So
yeah, absolutely, dude. If you don't mind, I do have something that I'm trying new here. And I spoke with Alec of the Gyro universe yesterday, and he was my first guinea pig. Maybe you could be my second. Awesome. What I'm trying to do is at the end of each episode now, refine 3 to 5 questions quicker questions that can act as like a break off episode that's like 5 to 15 minutes, let's say. So I have a couple of questions here that you could answer. So the first question would be, do you have a mantra or something to get you going when you want to create, but maybe aren't quite in the mood to create?
I have a mantra that's been important to me becoming the person that I am today. And so I'll throw that one at you. And it's hear your truth, see your truth, speak your truth, be your truth. And so what that does for me is it allows me to obviously make space for others during that process, by, first hearing, then, seeing, then speaking, but ultimately you still have to be who you are. And so at a very difficult time in my life before all of this, I kind of would say that to myself. And so that definitely is still something that pops in the back of my head.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Second question I have here is there an indispensable tool, one indispensable tool in your creator toolbox?
Absolutely. Bear. And it's an app. And they cloud storage, and you can use multiple devices, but like most things that Apple creates or that are created for Apple didn't create this app. It's so user friendly that it just, there's not all these different things you can do with it other than just type, so it doesn't feel overbearing. I can freely create. It allows me, and you would appreciate this, to open up a million tabs. And they're all just super sleek and easy to read, and you can change the color theme. And so it's just a very relaxing space to work in. So definitely.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah. Kind of a real life iteration of your web.
Absolutely.
Eyes on the prize. What's the prize?
The prize is to create another extension of what I would call the fantasy community. What I mean by that is Amashiq is a living and breathing place, and I've spent a lot more time there than most people. I want more inhabitants in Amashiq. I can go to Westeros if I want, right? Game of Thrones, and for those of you who may not know, I can go to Westeros whenever I want. I can hop on a forum and I can have any type of discussion with George R. R. Martin's rules and confines and all the things we discussed. The prize is that Amashiq can exist in the world like that for more than just me.
Beautiful. Yeah. You're hitting home runs with these questions. They're going better than I would expect for the second time asking them. These are the harder ones. The last two are kind of time travel questions. Advice you'd give to yourself when you had just started. So you looking back to November when we first spoke or thereabouts, maybe a year before then, but.
Man, that is tough, but I'll use advice that I got recently that really resonated with me and helped me. And that is slow down. The indie community isn't a fast-paced community. It is not the direct comic book market. And I think this just translates for anybody, right? Just slow down. You'll be here for longer than you think. It won't be as long as you want, but it'll be longer than you think. So slow down and appreciate the process.
Beautiful. Yeah. Another one, another one out of the park. And for the last one, another time travel question is a question you'd ask your future self. Let's say 3 to 5 years, you can pick. If you want to choose 10, you could choose 10.
A question that I would ask my future self, because that's actually a really good question, and I could go anywhere with that. But as it pertains to Ennead, how did you decide when they die?
Awesome. Jeff, it's a pleasure. I have so many more questions that we never, I think, scratch the surface. So anytime you want to hop back on and have a chat, just hit me up, and you're welcome to join again. And congratulations on the new baby.
Thank you.
Congratulations on continuously pursuing and expanding the world of Ennead. And Yeah, like I said, you're an inspiration to a lot of people who reach out to me and who I reach out to. So keep fighting the good fight, keep creating, and we look forward to all of your future success.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for having me. And I'll definitely hop back on here. So what we wait, November to July, what's that? I don't know, 8 months? Maybe we'll cut it in half. I hope to have something to talk about before then. So maybe I'll see you.
Beautiful. Yeah. Do you have a plan? I mean, in terms of promotion and next steps, help us sign off here with where people could find you and what you have on the immediate horizon.
So, and it kind of doubles back to that slow down piece. So I have Kickstarter coming next month, which will have books 5 and 6, which takes you up basically to the season finale of Arc 1. Then shortly after that, I'll be at New York Comic Con, which is actually really exciting. I'll be sharing a table with Honor Vincent, who's another awesome comic writer who has her own fantasy kind of historical fiction world that she's crafting. And so we'll be tabling together there. So that's really where my head is right now, getting prepared for that. And then beyond that, we bring Arc 1 to a close. Arc 1 it's an accomplishment for me as a creator, and I look forward to having the first of many ribbons tied in this story, where you get to see and experience who I am as a storyteller when you read these first 7 books. Not everything will be answered. Some things will just be started, but there will be some sense of a pause, of a breath. And so that's on the schedule for December, January. And that has a lot to do with how this next Kickstarter and Comic-Con do. I got some advice to slow down. And if those 2 events go well enough where I can slow down, then I will. And so that might be a good time to maybe jump back on. Maybe I'll be getting ready to go to Kickstarter, or maybe I'll be sitting back and relaxing and just building in silence again, because I like that part.
Very cool. Yeah, I might try to make it up to New York for the Comic-Con as well. Awesome. My old stomping ground. So if I do, I'll look you up. And until next time, enjoy your random, enjoy all the random, and keep creating.
Thank you.
My fellow randoms, thank you for listening to the episode with J.L. Johnson Jr. Jeff speaking, of course, about Ennead, the Rule of 9, his comic project that continues to unfold. And I expect, based on its success and the breadth of the world that he's developed and the many ideas that he has, that it will continue on for years to come. And it's really exciting to see not only the world develop in his mind, but also how he's able to articulate that and communicate that to readers in a way that it makes sense to them, because it is no small feat to bring all of those ideas into a 22 or 30 page comic, or even multiple comics, even 5 or 6 comics that amount to hundreds of pages. He has a very big world that he's developing, and I'm impressed with his ability to funnel it all into a comic and tell a linear story, but at the same time build the universe around these characters. So very excited to see where Jeff goes from here. And this was our second attempt, and a successful attempt, I think, again, at having a little bit of a quick 5-question sign off to act as a short standalone episode for this podcast with Jeff. And his answers were spot on. I think that we are refining the questions and refining the way that I ask the questions. And again, I look forward to evolving this segment of the episode and the podcast in the future. If you have any feedback on how I could better refine it, or any ideas of additional questions I could add in, let us know. And until next time, we will continue to pursue creativity. We will continue to communicate with other creatives and share ideas and all of the random that is involved in the creative process. I wish you best of luck and success and motivation and all of the good stuff you need to be active and productive creator. And until next time, enjoy the random. Thanks.